Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer. I am so excited to have Dr. William Davis with us today. William Davis, MD, is a cardiologist and author of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Wheat Belly: Lose the Wheat, Lose the Weight, and Find Your Path Back to Health, and several other books in the series. Wheat Belly, by the way, has just been recently revised and expanded. This new edition is just out of Wheat Belly. It's got updated programs and strategies. You're going to love it. The book has sold over 3 million copies in North America, and it's been published in 40 countries. Dr. Davis has had media appearances, including The Dr. Oz Show, CBS This Morning, and Live with Kelly. He's been featured on Bill O'Reilly and The Colbert Report, and in print media, including Women's World magazines and many other places. His blog is wheatbellyblog.com, and he has a pretty substantial presence there with 10 million visitors. It's so great to have you on the show, Dr. Davis.
Hey, Stephan, glad to be here.
So let's start by, for our listener, our viewer, getting them to understand why wheat is so maligned by so many doctors, because it's not the wheat itself. People have been eating wheat for hundreds, thousands, who knows, tens of thousands of years, but the wheat has changed and it's become a problem for us. Could you go into some more detail about that?
Yeah, wheat, you're right, has been consumed by humans for about 10 or 12,000 years, which, by the way, represents 0.6% of our time on Earth, less than 1%. When first humans did turn to the seeds of grasses, that's what wheat is, literally, there was an explosion in tooth decay, a doubling of knee arthritis, appearance of iron deficiency anemia. There were health problems. Okay. But you're right, it did sustain humans. There was a major downturn in health, but it did sustain us. But something weird happened around the 1970s, 1980s. There was a big push by agribusiness to make increased yield per acre. And this was achieved. One of the things that was achieved was converting a 4.5 or 5 foot tall plant down to an 18-inch tall, very short, stocky plant with very large seeds. This was called the high-yield semi-dwarf variant. And since that day in the 1970s, this has essentially replaced all wheat on this planet. And it did yield 4-fold, 5-fold, 8-fold more wheat per acre, wheat flour per acre. But when you change something so drastically, you also change its characteristics. You change its proteins, you change the effects on humans. So, for instance, one of the things that changed was the gliadin protein. People say gluten, but it's really the gliadin protein within gluten. And the gliadin protein was dramatically changed by these agricultural manipulations. One of the things they did, for instance, was amplify the potential of this protein to trigger celiac disease. So there's been a 4-fold increase in celiac disease since this change was introduced. They also did things like increase what's called phytate content. And phytates are nothing more than pesticides. It's a naturally occurring pesticide in wheat and other plants, and it keeps insects and rusts and molds away from the plant. But farmers and agricultural scientists increase the content of phytates for increased resistance to pests. But it's also highly toxic to humans. It binds all minerals in your gut, and you poop it out. So if you get magnesium, iron, calcium, zinc, manganese in your diet, you pass it out in the toilet. And of course, my colleagues treat iron deficiency anemia caused by grains with iron injections, iron supplements, blood transfusions. But it's an illustration of how modern healthcare has evolved to treat the consequences of grain consumption. The amylopectin A content of grains was increased by agribusiness and farmers because that's the carbohydrate. And more carbohydrates was thought to be a good thing. But now it explains why modern wheat raises blood sugar higher than almost all other foods, including table sugar. So we have this conglomeration of, not just a partial list, Stephan, there's more. A partial list of the reasons why human health is substantially degraded by consumption of wheat and grains. People see this as a gluten issue when gluten/gliadin is really only a small slice of the problems associated with wheat and grains.
Right. So it all like this big kind of sea change happened with the evolution of big agribusiness back in the 70s, and it's caused so much havoc in our food supply, loss of many variants, not just in wheat. We're talking about apples and everything. There were so many different variants of apples that are extinct now. It's really sad. There's a seed vault in Sol. How do you pronounce that? Svalbard or whatever in the Arctic Circle area, and they're storing some of these seeds that hopefully will be kind of resurrected and used in the future. But all these different variants are going obsolete or and extinct. It's very, very sad. What you didn't mention also in relation specifically to wheat and is a very contentious issue is glyphosate. So Roundup and the Roundup Ready crops and all that. How does that play into the whole equation here?
It's a big issue. No question. The emergence of glyphosate with wheat, whether it's used as a desiccant or whether it's used as a weed killer, whether it's used in genetically modified corn or soy, it's a huge problem because of its endocrine disrupting properties and its lymphoma causing properties. But if people often say, well, that's the only problem with wheat. Well, if that were true, all we'd have to do is eat organic wheat and we'd be absolved of all the problem. Of course, that's not true. You can still have ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, seborrheic psoriasis, and rheumatoid arthritis by eating wheat, even if it's organic. So glyphosate, no question, Stefan, a big part of the problem. And it's representative of the horrible practices of modern agribusiness, whether it's glyphosate or genetic modification or purposeful introduction of numerous mutations into plants, with never a question asked about human safety. Very few questions are asked. Very few clinical data exist to prove the safety of these things. And of course, now we have a world. I go out in my backyard. When I was a kid, it was full of crickets and grasshoppers and occasional toad, and there'd be fireflies and hummingbirds and lots of birds chirping. I go up my backyard in Wisconsin, not that heavily populated area, and there's no grass. I haven't seen grasshoppers in years. There's no fireflies. There's no hummingbirds. There are a tiny fraction of the birds because we've killed everything. And but what we're doing with wheat and grains and corn and soy and heirloom tomatoes is just part of a big, big landscape of problems introduced by big agribusiness.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I remember I spent a lot of time in Wisconsin myself, in Madison, in my adult life, and I'd be driving in the earlier years of my adulthood, and there'd be bugs getting smashed on the windshield as I was driving on the freeway. It doesn't happen anymore. So weird.
Oh, good point. Yeah, right.
The bugs are gone.
Now that you mention it. Yes. Good point.
So this is a big problem. This is a global catastrophe waiting to happen because as the pollinators disappear and the insect food for birds and other creatures that eat these insects, those go away. Then we lose other species up the food chain, and it's a domino effect that's going to be really sad and catastrophic potentially, I think.
Yeah. Obviously you and I and your listeners can't fix all the problems of the world that are being produced by big agribusiness, big pharma, big food, benign neglect of the U.S. government or the influence, the heavy-handed influence of industry in government policy, like the dietary guidelines. So my solution, Stefan, has been to, if you and I can't move the USDA, the FDA, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, we can at least help educate listeners, people willing to open their mind to the idea that the food pyramid is garbage, it's nonsense, that the stuff you buy in the supermarket, in the cereal aisle, is horribly detrimental to health, and that this reliance on prescription drugs is an absurd situation, including the emergence, the proliferation of biologic drugs that are draining the U.S. pocketbook. We're talking about drugs that cost $3,000-$4,000 per month per person that are almost completely unnecessary. that we have the means if you're given the right tools, but it won't come from your dietitian. It probably won't come from your doctor. And that was by the reason one of my motivations for writing the Undoctored book was because I saw people like your listeners taking the reins of health, and they'd tell me this. They'd say, you know what, I told my doctor I was going to do the wheat belly lifestyle. And my doctor said, don't do it. You're going to die of a heart attack. Here's Lipitor just in case. And this person would do it anyway, despite what the doctor says. And they'd come back 6 months, a year later and say, I did it. I lost 72 pounds. I'm no longer a type 2 diabetic. I'm off metformin, insulin, Byetta. I don't have rheumatoid arthritis. My ulcerative colitis is now gone. I don't take prednisone anymore. My psoriasis is gone. My depression is lifted. My migraine headaches are gone. I don't need Imitrex anymore. And the doctor says, just do what you're doing. There was no interest in what happened. What I would hope my colleagues would ask, occasionally some do, is, well, what the hell? What did I overlook? What did I fail to see? Tell me what you did, so I know, maybe I learned from your experience. That almost never happens, Stefan. It's this idea that the doctor has all the answers, and but what I saw happen, though, was people getting magnificent health and slenderness and functioning despite the doctor. Now, the corona pandemic highlights that we still do need a healthcare system. We do need ventilators and ICUs. There's no question about that. But the whole world of common chronic diseases that have overrun American health, type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, fatty liver, all that stuff people can manage on their own and obtain results that are dramatically superior to what the doctor's capable of achieving.
Yeah, that reminds me of how I've heard many times people say that we're not experiencing a healthcare system; it's a sick care system.
Absolutely, yes, well put.
Who was it who said supposedly said that let food be thy medicine? Is that Hippocrates?
I think that was Hippocrates. Yeah. Very, very prescient. Yeah. And I think that's true. Though I would tell you this too, though. One of the things that one of my bugaboos in the world of paleo and ketogenic diets and Atkins and South Beach is one of the lessons learned is diet is very powerful. Absolutely. But in a modern life where, for instance, you and I work indoors, we all wear clothes in public, we don't eat liver raw, we all need to take vitamin D. In a world where we get our water from the tap or a bottle or some other water filtration system where virtually all magnesium is removed, we need to replace magnesium. So I remind people that while diet is extremely powerful, you can't stop there. Mm-hmm. And with the emergence of the microbiome, what I'm seeing is, part of what I do is I try to help people restore the way their body was supposed to have been all along. So your body is ill-equipped to consume the seeds of grasses, that is wheat and related grains. It's adapted to being in this bright tropical sun while you run naked or near naked, vitamin D. It's adapted to getting rocks and minerals from water that are running over minerals, magnesium. But one of the things we've also done is massively disrupted our bowel flora. And that's become eminently clear when modern bowel flora is compared to the bowel flora of primitive cultures. And there's almost no resemblance. But in there are some very, very powerful, we're just starting to get those insights, but very powerful observations that when you restore what seems to be something closer to the normal, natural human microbiome, spectacular things happen.
Mm-hmm. So what would be some of those spectacular things?
Well, one of the things I kind of told you before we started recording, that is this restoration of a bacteria called Lactobacillus reuteri, Reuteri, after the German discoverer, Gerhard Reuter. And so if we believe what Reuter told us in the 20th century, that most people had this organism obtained by breastfeeding from your mom as an infant, and it should have persisted and proliferated in your gastrointestinal system. Unfortunately, antibiotics, herbicide, pesticide residues in food, and other factors have changed the microbiome, and one of the casualties of these changes is the loss of Lactobacillus reuteri. Now, Lactobacillus reuteri, oddly, has been found to be responsible for the release of oxytocin from the pituitary. And so when you get reuteri back, You have a flood of empathy for other people. You have a desire for social connection. So it makes me wonder, Stefan, is the loss of Lactobacillus reuteri at least part, not all, not entirely, but at least part of the explanation behind increasing social isolation, record suicide rates, increasing divorce rates? I think there's more to it, but I think it's a very, and that's what I see happening.
Yeah,
One of the
maybe
things I've
even a
done.
rise of narcissism.
That's an interesting idea. It could be. Well,
I had
so
one
in
of
an
the top
effort to,
experts on narcissism on this podcast. Yeah, and she was fascinating. Like just the differences between narcissists and sociopaths and psychopaths, and understanding how they think and whether they were created out of nurture or nature. And it was just fascinating discussion. So listeners, be sure to
that is a
check that
fascinating
out.
discussion.
Yeah.
I will tell you on a real world level. So one of the things we've done is a lot of the evidence surrounding this bacteria has to do with two specific strains. This is something called strain specificity in the microbiome. And very briefly, so you have E. coli in your gut. I have E. coli. Your listeners have E. coli. But if you eat, let's say, romaine lettuce from the Central Valley of California tainted by cow manure, you can die of E. coli. So same species, E. coli, different strains. So strain differences, strain specificity can literally be a life-death difference. So we have to pay attention. And unfortunately, when your listeners buy, let's say, a very costly, very expensive probiotic from the store, the strains aren't even specified, which is a major oversight. So, but we have to pay
Well, it might
attention.
not
As
be an
time goes on.
oversight. It might be on purpose because it
That
doesn't
could be
have the varieties that we really need in our diet, but they want to sell lots of the product, perhaps.
excellent point. I think that there's truth to that. But we get these two very specific strains of Lactobacillus reuteri, for which we have the evidence that it has certain other effects beyond the oxytocin type effects. But we buy it from a company who holds the patents. It's a company called BioGaia in Sweden. And they sell it to you in tablets because they're made for infants. Because the reuteri has been shown to reduce infantile colic. It's been shown to reduce infantile regurgitation of formula or breast milk and other benefits for newborns and children. But they sell it to us at very low counts. And so one of the things I did was I made yogurt. It's not really yogurt. It's generally dairy fermentation using a very specific process. And by the way, your readers can see this if they want to in my Wheat Belly blog. I have a step-by-step guide to making L-reuteri yogurt. But we use a very
I'll put
specific...
it in the show notes, the link to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We use extended fermentation. You know, if you buy yogurt at the grocery store, it's been fermented for 4 hours. When we make yogurt, we use 36 hours. And we ferment in the presence of prebiotic fibers, which is the food that bacteria eat. The end result is a rich, thick, delicious yogurt, and you consume a half cup a day, and it provokes oxytocin release. You get all those empathetic effects, desire for social connection, but you also get, many people get, an explosion in dermal collagen, such that the ladies love this. They start to lose their wrinkles within 4 weeks. Their skin becomes moister. Their hair becomes thicker and it grows faster. Your fingernails and toenails grow faster. Your sleep is deeper. You get a restoration of youthful muscle and strength. I gained 13 pounds of muscle in 3 weeks doing this. I go to the gym 15 minutes once a week. I don't like going to the gym, but I gained 13 pounds of muscle. And my strength, I'm going to be 63 this summer, and I'm handling
You don't
weight.
look it, by the way. You look younger
thank
than
you.
63 for sure.
I'm doing lat pull downs 200 pounds, leg press 415 numerous times, only because the machine doesn't go any higher. I'm too lazy to pack the plates on, the fixed plates.
You don't sound lazy at all, but okay.
There's a wonderful anorexigenic effect. It turns off your appetite, puts you in absolute control over appetite and impulse. Sleep is deeper and it's filled with vivid dreams. Libido goes up. In other words, it's the closest thing I've ever come across, Stephen, that turns the clock back 10 or 20 years. And it comes in the form of rich, thick, delicious yogurt.
That's awesome.
So it's the taste, I think, of some of the unbelievably spectacular things that are coming from these emerging insights in the microbiome.
Yeah, it's almost like a fountain of youth. And I kind of discovered a fountain of youth with stem cell therapy. My wife and I both got stem cell therapy treatments from Dr. Harry Adelson, who's Dave Asprey's stem cell doc. And yeah, it's it's pretty amazing. So they harvest stem cells from your bone marrow and your fats and re-inject it into different parts of your body. Let's say you've got joint pain in your knee, and the pain might go away, or back pain, or shoulder pain. My wife had shoulder pain for a couple of years that almost completely went away after this treatment. It came back eventually after we just had a baby 7 months ago. Well, she had the baby. I assisted. And carrying that very heavy and energetic baby around all the time has really messed her shoulder up again. The same one. But for 2 years, she had relief. Nothing else worked. So the stem cell therapy is kind of a bit of a secret weapon, too. But
Fabulous.
by the way, the
Great.
episode listeners for Dr. Harry Adelson is definitely worth a listen. So, are you familiar with stem cell therapy at all?
I am, but I would not regard myself as an expert.
Yeah. So I'm not an expert either, but I've gotten some pretty good exposure to it. And so, if we were to kind of hand pick what strains we would want in our probiotic to feed our microbiome, would it be that particular strain that you mentioned? What was it again?
Rotari?
Rotari, thank you. So that would probably be one of them, and we would want to keep that in our diet, I would imagine. But isn't there something to be said for rotating in and out different strains to get the enough of a variety and not overwhelm your gut with the same several strains over and over and over again?
You're making a crucial point, Stefan, that nobody has an answer to, and that is, so if we were infants and breastfeeding from our moms, and a mom gave us Lactobacillus rotari, you would have it for the rest of your life. But if I take Lactobacillus rotari now as tablets or a yogurt, it would last for a few days, maybe 2 weeks, and then it's gone. So there's something fundamentally missing from the whole probiotic understanding. I think what it is, this is my speculation stuff, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think this is where the science is heading. I think the problem is not so much which species we're getting in a probiotic, because right now probiotics are very crude Model Ts of what they should be, like not specifying strain.
Right.
But I think the real fundamental problem is that we're lacking what I call, this is my terminology, foundational species. That is, the handful of species, maybe 10, 12, 20, whatever, that their very presence supports the proliferation and health of dozens to hundreds of other species. I think one of those species is Akkermansia muciniphila, which, by the way, we can't take as a probiotic yet. It'll probably be coming in about a couple of years. There's a very specific difficulty in producing it as a probiotic preparation. But when you have sufficient 4 or 5% of all of the entire microbiome occupied by Akkermansia, it supports the proliferation and growth of at least a dozen other species. So I think where this is going is that you and I try to restore those so-called foundational species, and you don't have to take all those other thousands.
Right.
Because
it's almost like a scaffolding that for your gut microbiome.
A scaffolding, or a farmer who mines the cattle and the pigs and the corn and not the corn maybe, but the squash, the lettuce. In other words, somebody to cultivate and mind the garden. Yeah. I think that's where this is going. But unfortunately, it means that you, me, and our listeners are still left with what are very crude preparations. So I don't think anybody really knows what the full answer is. So I think the answer in the meantime is to either rotate, as you say, or increase variety, and that variety includes fermented foods, whether it's rotari yogurt or other forms of yogurt or kefirs, kimchi, kombucha, fermented veggies in your kitchen. Yeah. And there's many ways to do this.
How about Yakult?
But it is clear.
Are you familiar with Yakult?
Well, let's talk about that. I'd love to talk. I was going to actually raise that.
Okay.
So you may know that. So you know that Yakult is a source of Lactobacillus casei, of a very specific strain, the Shirota strain, that when you get sufficient counts, it reduces respiratory virus, the likelihood of a respiratory virus, which is very relevant right now with corona but it reduces respiratory viral illnesses by 50%. And if you do get a respiratory viral illness, it abbreviates by 50% or more, in addition to resulting in reduction in multiple inflammation markers, as well as perceived things like knee pain. So one of the things I did, so as you know, you buy the Yakult, and it comes in those little garbage containers with non-fat sugar, non-fat dairy and sugar. So stuff nobody should be drinking, but it comes with 6.5 billion counts of Lactobacillus casei shirota. So I did the same thing we did with the Reuteri, and that is we made yogurt, once again using extended fermentation. Let me say a word about that extended fermentation. So you may remember, your listeners may remember that old riddle to kids. If I give you a penny on day one and double it every day over the course of a month, how much money do you have at the end of the month? The kids say, oh, $1,000 or $10,000. It's over $5 million, right? But that increase in money, so day one, a penny, day two, 2 cents, day three, 4 cents, 8 cents, 6, it seems like nothing. But by day 30, you're up into the millions of dollars. Same thing happens with bacteria. The initial few hours, there's virtually no increase in counts. Yet commercial yogurt is fermented over 4 hours. So we're fermenting so that we get those huge ramp up in numbers, hour 30, 34, 36. And we get around, with the Reuteri, we get about 90 billion per half cup serving. We haven't quantified in the Shirota fermentation. Shirota's doubling time is about half as, it's double, twice as fast as Reuteri, half the doubling time. So we get well over 100 billion, because all that evidence that shows us a reduction in respiratory viral illnesses tend to involve very high counts. One of the best studies involved 100 billion of the Shirota. So when you make the yogurt, you take 6.5 billion, or at least what's in a tablespoon or so to start your yogurt culture, and you get over 100 billion. And you once again get a rich, thick, delicious yogurt. Now, people say, well, I don't want to eat dairy. Well, you can do this with coconut. You can do it with other things. You can ferment other things with it. And though I will say, fermenting dairy is the most forgiving process. So if you can tolerate dairy, if you don't have problems with casein, beta-A1, and whey and lactose, it's a very forgiving way to generate very high bacterial counts.
Gotcha. And so what is that product called, that your version of this of this yogurt with that particular strain?
The KCI, the Shirota?
Yeah.
It's something we make in our own kitchens. We just happen to use the Yakult as our starting bacteria.
Oh, gotcha. So you don't have a product available to buy.
Oh, no.
You just have a blog post or something that explains the process for how to grow it.
Yeah, in my Wheat Belly blog, I've got it's really a very simple recipe. It's a tablespoon or two of the Yakult.
Yep.
Mix it with some prebiotic fiber. We use 2 tablespoons inulin, raw potato starch, acacia starch. Add a couple tablespoons of, I like to use organic half and half because we follow a high-fat lifestyle. Organic half and half, couple tablespoons. Make a slurry because the prebiotic fiber will clump. Then add the remainder of the organic half and half. Stir it, of course. Cover lightly, and then keep it 100 degrees Fahrenheit for about 36 hours. At the end of that process, refrigerate, and you'll have this. If you consume a half a cup, you'll get mega dose exposure to the KCI Shirota, and thereby probably all those benefits that have been seen. There have been other bacterial strains that have been shown to reduce risk of respiratory viruses, but the evidence is by far, I'm very impressed you knew this, the evidence is best by far for the Shirota species obtained from Yakult.
That's amazing. Awesome. Now if somebody doesn't eat or consume dairy, what could be the kind of next best thing? And I understand that it does. I understand that it doesn't. It's not as forgiving to use these other substrates. But let's say it's coconut yogurt or soy yogurt. I'm not. I try to avoid too much soy because of the estrogenic nature of it. But the kind of next best thing, what would it be?
Coconut milk is the next best choice. It lacks, of course, casein beta-A1. It doesn't have whey, doesn't have lactose, but it's much fussier. So what you have to do with coconut, a lot of people heat their dairy first. You don't have to do that if it's pasteurized. They do that to increase mouthfeel and thickness, but the end result using the methods I use yields an already wonderful mouthfeel and thickness. But coconut, you do have to heat to 180 degrees. Then we use pectin. Heat activate the pectin at that same temperature. Stir it in, let it dissolve. We let it cool to room temperature, or at least lower than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, because bacteria die, these strains die at that temperature. Then you have to add prebiotic fiber, 2 tablespoons of prebiotic fiber, if you want to follow the methods I use for super duper high bacterial counts. Then you hit it with a stick blender to suspend the coconut fat in the aqueous portion. Then you add your bacteria, either a former batch of yogurt or whatever you're using as a starter, whether it's KCI Schroeder or rhodorite tablets or whatever you're using as a bacterial source.
Got it.
So it's a lot fussier. There's a preheating process, activation of pectin, and then emulsification with a stick blender. But it's doable. You can also ferment other things. I'm currently fermenting mango juice in my kitchen with the KCI.
Okay.
It takes longer. People say, I don't drink juice, I'm low carb. Well, you let it ferment long enough so the bacteria take care of the sugar for you and convert it to various metabolites. Yeah.
Nice.
And it makes a kind of a fizzy drink.
Yeah, that sounds great. And is that in your blog as well?
That is in my blog, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll include links to all these things. I'll search them out and add links, listeners, so you can go to my show notes and get that. Awesome. And where do you think Epicor lies in this kind of ecosystem of probiotics? Because Epicor I've been taking for 2 years now on the recommendation of somebody I know in one of my masterminds that I'm in. And his family, they are, I don't know, like 5 or 10% of the global production of this particular supplement for cattle, for feed. So they are a global, massive manufacturer, and that's how he found out about Epicor, because that's one of the prime ingredients that they add to the feed to keep the animals from getting sick. And so he's been taking it forever, and he never gets sick. He never gets a cold, ever. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to try this out. And I've been taking Epicor for 2.5 years, and the amount of times I get sick with colds or flus or anything like that is easily a quarter of what I used to experience. So seems to be working.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
Do you know what it's made of?
Yeah, so Epicor, it is a safe and natural whole food fermentation ingredient.
Yeah,
it doesn't give me the details. I want to know exactly what's in it. Okay, so it's made using natural yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that goes through a closely held trade secret process here. So I don't know what the magic is of this, but it's been working like gangbusters for me and for
good to know stuff. I don't know what that is. No experience.
Yeah, so Epicor is an ingredient in many immune supplements, but it's a branded trademark, and you don't really know what the strains are and what the process is and all that, apparently, from my understanding. So it's not yeast, it's not beta glucan. It is a product of a fermentation process. It is a probiotic, I think, and it's like magic. So I've been taking it lately in this product from Hyperbiotics, and it's called Hyperbiotics Immune, which they no longer make. They've got Immune Defense, which is a different product, and so forth. So I'm actually going to switch to a different source for this from Nootropics Depot. I just purchased some Epicor from them, which is just Epicor. It doesn't have all the extra stuff, the echinacea and so forth, that Hyperbiotics Immune has. But it's just been really, really good. So the first 2 bottles, what I had were just pure Epicor, nothing else, but then I switched to Hyperbiotics Immune, which its main ingredient is Epicor, but it's also got echinacea and zinc and some other things. And yeah, I rarely, if ever, get sick. It's pretty cool.
All right, very interesting. I learned something.
Yeah, cool. Now, I want to ask you about fecal transplants because some people's microbiome is so messed up that they need to swallow a pill that has somebody else's feces in it in order to fix their microbiome, which sounds like a horrible, horrible thing to have happen. But what would you have to say about that?
I think there's a time and place when you have Clostridium difficile enterocolitis, that is, we say C. diff, typically from taking a prior course of antibiotics, though now occurring spontaneously. So people who haven't heard of this, it's a very dreaded side effect of taking antibiotics where there's a proliferation. So you kill off healthy bacteria, and you allow the proliferation of this unhealthy organism, Clostridium difficile, which causes a bloody diarrhea. It's very painful, and if you don't treat it, you can die. It's very poorly responsive, and it's increasingly resistant to antibiotics. So these people are miserable, not responding to antibiotics. So one of the things you can do is either truly a fecal transplant, where via an enema or an endoscopy, you're given someone else's stool. Or, as you say, you can concentrate the bacteria of someone else's, a presumed healthy person, of which, by the way, there's no such thing anymore, probably. But in other words, a presumed healthy person's bacteria from their stool, concentrate in a capsule, and you swallow it. And the success rate, those two maneuvers, is 90% or greater. So it's a vivid illustration of the power of bowel flora and the microbiome. My reservations are that it's also a way to monetize. So healthcare always tries to turn every health problem into a drug or procedure because that's how they get paid. And now let's put aside C. diff, because I think there's what's happening in the world of fecal transplants. They're trying to expand it to ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and celiac disease and autoimmune. They're trying to make it a kind of a very broad spectrum tool. But my fear for that, Stefan, is that there's so many things you could do before you resort to fecal transplantation, such as you may have heard this. I think we could argue that there is a pandemic, not a corona pandemic, but a much larger pandemic, one that is as large as or bigger than the epidemics of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and prediabetes. And we know that type 2 diabetes and prediabetes now includes about 103 million Americans, according to the CDC. But if we tally up all the people who I think have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, where unhealthy bacteria have proliferated and then ascended up from the colon into the ileum, jejunum, duodenum, and stomach, I think we have over 150 million Americans in that umbrella of having had SIBO. But the funny thing is, it doesn't show up as SIBO. It shows up as fibromyalgia, the aches and pains of fibromyalgia. It shows up as Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It shows up as restless leg syndrome. It shows up as rosacea or psoriasis. In other words, we have this 30-foot-long concentration of unhealthy bacterial species, SIBO, that they're confined to the gastrointestinal tract, but part of SIBO is also an increase in intestinal permeability and the free access of bacterial breakdown products into the bloodstream. But this is called, a very awkward name, metabolic endotoxemia. But what it means is this concentration of 30 feet of bacteria can now export their effects to the brain and contribute or cause Parkinson's disease or Lou Gehrig's disease, or contribute to Alzheimer's dementia, or it could cause the aches and pains of fibromyalgia, or the skin rash of rosacea, or the restless leg syndrome. And we know, for instance, that of the people with fibromyalgia, probably 100% have SIBO. Of the people with irritable bowel syndrome, probably between 44 and 84% have SIBO. Of the people with an autoimmune disease, probably 50, 60, 70% have SIBO. Of the people with obesity and type 2 diabetes, at least half have SIBO, and that alone is a huge number. Add all those numbers up, and you come to an enormous sum that is, I mean, unprecedented. And so if you treat that with fecal transplant, you never understood how that person got there, what they can do to more naturally to spare themselves a procedure and medical costs. Uh, and once you've had these kinds of processes, they love to come back, and you haven't instructed that person. So I think there's a more rational prescription emerging for dealing with a lot of health problems. Not necessarily C. diff. C. diff is life-threatening, so those people may have to go through fecal transplant. But let's say that people with ulcerative colitis, where fecal transplant has been shown to be effective, well, maybe we shouldn't do fecal transplant as a first choice. Maybe we should address the other factors that led them to have ulcerative
the
colitis.
underlying cause. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of those causes, not in everybody, but I think in a lot of those people, is SIBO.
And how do you check to see if you have an issue with SIBO?
Well, first there are kind of telltale signs. Telltale signs would be seeing fat droplets in the toilet, because fat malabsorption is part of SIBO. A fat staining rim in the toilet where the water meets the porcelain. Intolerance to what we call prebiotic fibers, which are things like legumes. So if somebody says, I can't eat beans. If I do, I get all kinds of gassy and blood. That's SIBO, particularly if you have it within the first 60 to 90 minutes of consumption. There are diagnoses that are synonymous with SIBO. So fibromyalgia, virtually guaranteed you have SIBO. Irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, is virtually synonymous with SIBO. Restless leg syndrome, virtually synonymous. Rosacea and psoriasis, virtually synonymous. So those are, if you have those things, you can bet that you have SIBO, and then you can embark on a process either to validate or to prove it, and then manage it. But there's also now a very cool consumer device. So up till recently, if one of your listeners wanted to know, they say things like, I've had IBS for 10 years. I have bowel urgency. I can't drive to the store because I never know I'm going to have an explosive bowel movement. So very incapacitating. Up till recently, to prove whether this was SIBO, you'd have to do formal what's called breath hydrogen gas testing. It's a pain in the ass. You have to go to a lab. You have to go to the doctor. Often the doctor has no idea what this thing is. That's another issue, doctor ignorance. But even if he does know, he sends you someplace to get it done, costs you hundreds of dollars, if not more. And there's often a need for repeated testing. Identification at first. Did you respond to management? Is there recurrence? So hundreds of dollars each time, many hours of your day. It takes about 3 to 4 hours to do the test. So it's a pain. But about a year ago, a device called the AIRE device, AIRE, came out from a funny company called Food Marble. A guy in Dublin and a guy in the US invented this device. I don't have it with me, but you blow into it and it talks to your smartphone and it shows you whether you're blowing hydrogen gas.
Wow.
Now, there's a very specific way to do this. It has to be, you want to do a baseline. There's an overnight fast, baseline, and then consume a prebiotic fiber. Because prebiotic fibers are consumed by bacteria. You can ingest them, but you can't digest them. But some bacterial species convert those prebiotic fibers to hydrogen gas. And if you blow hydrogen gas at high concentrations, this thing measures 0 to 10. 10 is high. Within the first, particularly 90 minutes, maybe longer, you've got bacteria in the upper gastrointestinal tract. And then you can embark on a course of managing it. I will tell you, Stephan, it's probably one of the more complicated things. I love giving people tools to manage their own health because I think my colleagues, the physicians, have abdicated their responsibility. Yeah, they're good at managing ICUs and ventilators, but they suck at managing real health. If you want health, the last person you ask is a doctor. They have no idea. So when you hear things like, is it really safe to take fish oil? It could thin your blood. Ask your doctor. Your doctor doesn't know. The doctor has no idea.
Yeah,
he knows
all these items that say if you're pregnant or nursing, consult your doctor. Yeah,
the doctor has no
That's pretty
idea.
Laughable. Yeah,
that is. But I love giving people tools they can use on their own. And the truth of it is, sadly, I wish it wasn't this way. If one of your listeners went to their doctor and said, hey, you know what? I've got fibromyalgia or irritable bowel syndrome, or I'm completely intolerant to prebiotic fibers. If I have, let's say, a bowl of chili, I've got gas, diarrhea, and bloating within 30 minutes, and it lasts for a day. The doctor says,
Yeah. That
Take a
sounds
stool.
unfortunate. Yeah, take some Mylanta or
Yeah,
something.
take an take an anti-diarrheal or something, some lame advice like that. Uh, and your listeners, no, I think I have SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. The doctor says, I don't know what that is. Don't waste my time. Did you consult Dr. Google? If he or she is doing her job, they may send you to a gastroenterologist. Yeah, and I tell you this, Stephan, because I've seen this so many times. The gastroenterologist says we're going to do an upper endoscopy and a colonoscopy because they love doing that because that's where the money is.
Mm.
They say, good news, you don't have a stomach ulcer, you don't have colon cancer. See ya. And your listener says, well, wait a minute. What about my SIBO question? Don't waste my time. Get out of here. You're fine. I didn't see anything. In other words, there's no interest. At the very most, a small percentage will say something like this. Here's a prescription for rifaximin, which is the conventional antibiotic for SIBO, which has 60% efficacy, but no mention made how you got it, how you can increase that efficacy rate, and how to prevent the very common recurrences, nor how to detect it on your own in future. So the medical answer to SIBO, despite it being so ubiquitous, is lousy. And so that's how I see my role, is trying to help people understand that you can, and this is what I do every day, every week, help people, among other things, identify their SIBO and then manage it. Now, thankfully, there are 2 herbal antibiotic regimens. So you don't have to take the rifaximin. There are 2, which I was very skeptical about, because herbal antibiotics are a very iffy area, but now we have pretty good evidence that 2 herbal antibiotic regimens are as effective as rifaximin, perhaps superior.
Oh.
So that's so we do that. We take
So
steps
what
to
are
increase
those
efficacy.
ones, and where do you get them?
There's a candibactin regimen, candibactin AR and BR, another one called FC-Cidal and disbiocide. I would tell your listeners, though, as much of a champion I am of self-management and being undoctored, this is an area where you really want some assistance, guidance, and feedback. So this is a much more, if we start with diet and basic strategies like vitamin D and iodine and thyroid optimization, basic efforts to cultivate healthy bowel flora like a high-potency multi-species probiotic and prebiotic fibers from fermented foods, this SIBO, and by the way, its cousin, fungal overgrowth, are more advanced methods. And these really require a little bit of, a functional medicine doc, integrative health. One of the things I also do is we have kind of a deep dive called my Undoctored Inner Circle website, but it's a membership website because it requires a lot of staff, a lot of people. We have health coaches, those kinds of people, but they can tell you things like, gee, Mary, maybe you should take N-acetylcysteine for its biofilm disruptive properties because of your SIBO. Maybe you should include an antifungal regimen because half the people with SIBO also have fungal overgrowth. And occasionally when you manage SIBO, fungal overgrowth replaces it because bacteria and fungi compete. So there's a little bit more than you want to hear in an hour.
Gotcha. But what's that membership website again?
Undoctored Inner Circle.
Okay. I'll link to that in the show notes.
So I do this. We every Wednesday night, for instance, we have a 2-way video interaction with about 100 people, and we talk about SIBO, SIFO, the diet, vitamin D, etc. Yeah. So it's not entirely undoctored, but it is, and we have seen spectacular results. And I would have told you 3-4 years ago, Stephan, that SIBO was this uncommon thing that afflicts very few. Now I realize, and confirmed, by the way, by the AIR device, by the testing of the AIR device, where people are blowing 10 on the device, and then after herbal antibiotic, et cetera, all those other efforts, blowing 1.2, 1.3, and saying, my fibromyalgia for the first time in 10 years is gone. I'm off Lyrica. I'm off prednisone. I'm completely pain-free. Just an interesting aside for this common problem called SIBO, recurrences, because recurrences can involve a whole different landscape of bacterial species. So if your problem was, let's say, irritable bowel syndrome, bowel urgency, the recurrence might be panic attacks or some other symptom because of a change in bowel flora composition. So if you had to go back to the doctor, you have to go through the hassle of all that and the expense. But if you've got that little AIR device, you blow, you know within 2 minutes whether it's recurrent SIBO or not. So I liken this, Stephan, to blood glucose checks in diabetics. You may not remember way back when diabetics didn't have finger stick blood glucoses and all they had was urine dips. they were in the dark. If you had an infant, for instance, and the infant became unconscious, is their blood sugar 800 or 30? And it was very difficult. And this was the age when people, and this was still in the 80s, when people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes had kidney failure and blindness and heart disease uh, at age 27. Well, now that's been extended because when blood glucose monitors came out in the 80s and 90s, you would know my blood sugar is 325. Here's how to dose my insulin. My blood sugar is 60. I don't need insulin. I need something else. Well, that was a game changer.
Yeah.
Not to say that management of diabetes is perfect. It's not. It's horrible. But but at least from the standpoint of blood sugar, they had this great tool. I think the air device for breath hydrogen gas, and by the way, I have no relationship with the company. Breath hydrogen gas and some other measures that are emerging now are the same kind of game changer for gastrointestinal health. It is a hugely helpful tool.
That's amazing. I'm so excited to check that product out. I want to dig into that. So SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and that's a condition. And SIFO, what is the F in SIFO?
Small intestinal fungal overgrowth.
Fungal overgrowth.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And so that's fascinating. And you said there are plenty of tools that are going to be easier to start with, and you rattled off a few examples. I think you mentioned iodine as one, vitamin D. Like what would be some of these easier tools that you can kind of do it yourself and not mess up?
Well, so this is kind of back where, so let's say somebody's on, whether it's a wheat belly diet, my diet, or undoctored lifestyle, or we call it ketogenic or paleo or low carb or Atkins or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's your diet. But one of the things you want to tackle also, particularly in this modern day and age, is insulin resistance. Because the diet often does improve insulin resistance, but there may have been changes in your body that don't allow diet alone to take its effect. Mm-hmm. So vitamin D restoration. We try to achieve a 25 hydroxy vitamin D blood level of 60 to 70 nanograms per milliliter, typically achieved by a dose of 5,000 to 6,000 units per day of an oil-based gel cap. We all take fish oil to obtain about 3,600 milligrams EPA DHA per day, because that yields a blood level of omega-3s of about 10% or greater, for which that's where all the benefits really derive. We make sure we get iodine. I'm in Wisconsin, which is the former goiter belt, where 20 to 25% of the population walked around with these huge goiters until iodized salt came along in 1924. And goiters went away. Then the FDA stepped in, their great wisdom said, quit using all that salt. And people stopped using salt, iodine deficiency, and then now goiters are coming back. So we address iodine and thyroid optimization. We obtain magnesium, like we talked about, because we all drink filtered water, not river water or stream water.
Yeah.
And then
I do take living spring water, so that's pretty cool. It's got all that good living stuff in there, but it doesn't last a long time, so you don't want to have that hanging around for several months. You want to use it up within a month. So, yeah.
Your listeners might want to know about one of the things I do for magnesium. So one of the problems we have with magnesium is because we all start with profound magnesium deficiency, including in the repository of magnesium, our bones. If you try to compensate with tablets, you're going to have a horrible case of diarrhea because they have a laxative potential. So one of the things I encourage people to do is to make magnesium bicarbonate, which is a very highly absorbed form of magnesium, but you can't buy it because it's so water absorbent, hygroscopic as a powder. It doesn't persist as a powder. It becomes this stone solid rock. So we make it with unflavored milk of magnesia, magnesium hydroxide, and carbonated water like seltzer. The recipe is in all my stuff. It's in all my Wheat Belly books, Wheat Belly blog, Undoctored book, Undoctored. I put it everywhere. But it's called magnesium water, and it's a simple reaction between the magnesium hydroxide, milk of magnesia, and the carbonic acid, and the result is water and magnesium bicarbonate. So it's essentially unflavored water, but it's the most highly absorbed form of magnesium. So I urge people who have some urgent need to replace magnesium, like heart rhythm disorders, uncontrolled hypertension, painful muscle cramps like in the calves, or osteoporosis and osteopenia. So if I take, let's say, magnesium malate, magnesium glycinate, magnesium chelate, magnesium citrate, one of those forms, as a tablet or capsule, it takes typically 2 years or longer to replenish body magnesium, and even then, 2 years is early. With the magnesium water, it typically takes weeks, maybe months. It's much faster. So if you have, let's say, incapacitating calf cramps, you don't want to wait 2 years.
Right.
Or migraine headaches. So the magnesium water can come to the rescue.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. I'm gonna try that out. Okay, this is amazing. I know we're running short on time, but I really wanted to cover this topic briefly and get your insights on it. So the links between autism and gut health and like issues with the microbiome are showing up in scholarly literature, and I'm curious what your take is on this, and how would somebody prevent autism in their or at least help with lowering the likelihood of them, their child, maybe an infant, getting autism by making sure they're getting a good microbiome or building a good microbiome. And then also for somebody who has a child with autism, what can they do in regards to the microbiome and all the gut problems that child is probably facing?
It's a very tough issue, Stefan, and I'm not an expert in autism. But the things I do know, we do know that kids with autism, established autism, do respond to, they say, a gluten-free diet. I would urge them to be a grain-free diet. That's a step beyond being gluten-free, and it avoids all the garbage replacement foods made with cornstarch, rice flour, tapioca starch, and potato flour that replace a problem with another problem. So I would say go grain-free and don't resort to garbage gluten-free replacement products. That alone has some beneficial effect.
Gotcha.
There may be some beneficial effect identifying other allergens, but I suspect a lot of these people, and this is holding true, that a lot of these kids have massive disruptions of bowel flora, SIBO and perhaps SIFO. Now, what's not clear, though, is how did this child develop all this problem? And how did they develop so early in life? So it's likely that something happened either at birth or shortly thereafter, or even more likely in utero. Is there something wrong with mom's bowel flora? Is there something wrong with mom's health that laid the foundation for a child to be born with this condition or develop it rapidly and then develop all these consequences like SIBO, SIFO, food intolerances? By the way, a lot of food intolerances, because I get tied up in these conversations, you could call it nightshade intolerance, FODMAP intolerance, lectin intolerance, fructose intolerance. The majority of those are SIBO.
Really?
Yeah. So if you address the SIBO, what happens is they say, you know what, I couldn't eat potatoes or eggplant or tomatoes like nightshades, or I couldn't have histamine provoking foods. Now I can. And there are also some instances where people say, I couldn't have dairy, I was lactose intolerant. They become lactose tolerant. So it's a vivid illustration of the power of the microbiome in correcting, at least trying to correct the microbiome. Right.
Interesting.
But I don't know.
My stepmom has intolerance to nightshade foods. Interesting. So she might have SIBO then.
She might get an air device in her stocking this Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Usually she gets, or they both get Amazon gift cards, but then who knows what they're getting with it. Now I think I'm going to pick this. Yeah. Very interesting. And so last really quick question, sprouted grains. What's your take on that? Is that better than not sprouted? Is it still not good and you should just avoid grains altogether?
The sprouting process reduces somewhat. It'll reduce the phytate content a little bit. It'll reduce the wheat germ agglutinin, and we haven't talked about that, but wheat germ agglutinin is a very potent bowel toxin. It's also a pesticide. It's a pest-resistant factor, so farmers have chosen strains of wheat and grains with higher wheat germ agglutinin content, but it also increased the toxicity of wheat to humans. So sprouting or fermentation reduces the wheat germ gluten content a little bit. It reduces the amylopectin A carbohydrate content a little bit. It degrades some of the gliadin, but the vast majority of it is still there. So it would be like, if I said, "Hey, Stefan, you know what? If you replace those damn um, full tar unfiltered cigarettes with these nice filtered low tar cigarettes, you'd be
It's so
fine."
so much better for you. Yes.
Right. Same situation.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, this has been amazing, and I am so excited to try out some of the stuff. I had no idea about like magnesium water and the air device and everything. So thank you so much.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm glad it was helpful.
Yeah, and if you could again mention those two websites, so your blog and then your membership site, so that our listener can go check those out and perhaps become a member of the site and get some great health advice.
A good intro to a lot of this stuff is the Wheat Belly blog and also the Undoctored blog. Um, the most recent book, which is the Wheat Belly Revised and Expanded. I did take all the books before, I think 8 books before, and all the updated information, put it into one concise volume, and that's the Revised Expanded Wheat Belly. I reserve the Undoctored Inner Circle. If you're casual and don't give a crap and just want to lose a few pounds, don't join the Undoctored Inner Circle. That's a place where you go for places like, I think I have SIBO. My doctor's useless. I need to know. I have coronary disease. All they do is say, take Lipitor and follow a low-fat diet, which does nothing, by the way. I need more. That's Undoctored Inner Circles. That's the place for the really serious person who wants to be empowered in health.
Yeah, which I would hope would be most of our listeners. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, Stephen.
Dr. Davis, this was fabulous. And now, listener, please take some proactive, powerful actions from this and read the expanded edition of Wheat Belly and change your life and the lives of your loved ones. And we'll catch you in the next episode of Get Yourself Optimized.